I'll start off by saying welcome. Welcome to the new news audiences. I'm really excited to share with you all the different insights and findings that we've got in this report, all focused on the state of journalism today, what we're able to notice looking at the data and the audience data behind this, and also some indications as to where it's headed. So I'll start off by just introducing the panel who you're going to be hearing from today. PJ, do you want to start by saying hi?
Hi, I'm PJ, and looking forward to getting stuck into this.
Awesome.
Hi, everyone. Davide here. Really excited to be part of this conversation. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I'm Alex, and as I mentioned, also very excited to be getting into everything with you all. So, who are we? I think obviously a lot of you will be familiar with at least one of the two brands who you'll see, mentioned throughout this presentation. So on the one hand, we have Pulsar, who are an audience intelligence company. The insights generated by Pulsar are very much organized around, what do audiences think? What can we deduce from looking at social and media data to really understand the big trends, the big movements that motivate and run through society? Whereas Vuelio is a more traditional media monitoring service, so obviously got a really good pedigree in the UK, a lot of history in terms of looking at everything from newspapers to more modern media types, and being able to talk to a lot of PR and comms about how that helps them craft their own messaging. What we'll be covering today, I'll hand over to PJ to go over this in a lot more detail, but generally speaking, we're going to split this into a few main sections. Obviously, it looks like quite a lot here, but it's broadly split between, a look at where we're at today, like what people think about journalism, the role of platforms in the evolution or the rapid acceleration we see around journalism, the hyper-connectedness of the industry today, and also a few comments on, where some brands are within this, both the bigger brands and some of the smaller, lesser-known ones. But obviously, these all come together to form a single ecosystem. But PJ, you can probably go over this in a lot more detail.
Yeah, so this looks like a lot, and we are going to be looking at a lot of data today, but I'll go through this quickly. So we're looking at, this is a huge topic, and we've done quite a few different reports already on this, like going into all of this a lot deeper, that you can look at over on the Vuelio blog. But yes, so the basics. So journalism is, we're going to be looking at how audiences across the world perceive journalism these days. Particularly in 2024 as well. The audiences of news avoidance. So I'm sure we all know someone who doesn't want to have any interaction, who doesn't want to read the news, doesn't want to hear about it these days. That's a common thing, particularly in the UK. So we're going to be looking at, why that's happening, and also what media brands are doing to get people back into the news as well. The role of podcasts, it sometimes feels like everybody has a podcast these days, but a lot of the big media brands are launching podcasts as well, and they're getting a lot of success with it, getting people back into the news. TikTok journalism has really, really changed the media industry, particularly this year as well. So we're going to be looking at TikTok journalists and how, again, they're getting people back into engaging with the news in new ways as well, and how big media brands are making the most of this new platform. How scoops spread. We'll be looking at particular stories and how they have spread across different platforms. So maybe starting in traditional newspapers, going onto social media, and then ending up like maybe going into like the political realm as well, actually impacting specific people who were involved in these stories as well. Then we are going to look at media brands and journalism, who is trusted, who is still getting a lot of engagement from audiences across the world. And then we're going to be doing a deep dive into local journalism, which is an area that has been in steep decline for quite a while now, but is making a comeback, particularly in the UK this year. And we'll be looking at a couple of different specific local news brands and what they're doing to get communities back into local journalism.
Wonderful. Thank you, PJ. So I'm the person who's going to be kicking this off a little bit and taking you through a brief intro of the state of journalism as a whole, a couple of charts that kind of speak to that state of journalism, but in general, looking at journalism and its audiences as a practice, as a profession, as an industry, the news media industry. And I really hope you'll forgive me for starting on a slightly more sobering note than most other webinars that you probably attended. I promise it's not going to be all gloomy, and Alex and PJ are certainly going to project us into more uplifting, innovative, and hopeful territory. But I believe that it's good to look at the problems, because the problems sometimes have the keys to the solutions. And journalism itself, it's been in a crisis for a couple of decades now. That's something that I have observed firsthand. I was a journalist in 2007, 8, 9. I did a master's in journalism. I worked at the Wall Street Journal. I worked at AFP, the French Newswire, and across like the news organizations and newsrooms that I was working with, I could start to see the cracks that have become much more clear in the years and decades to follow. And in order to get us all on the same page about like where journalism right now, I took these 5 points from the excellent Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at Oxford University. They do an amazing work of looking at the profession and at the practice and understanding what forces and what dynamics are shaping that. And these are 5 things that they've listed about the state of journalism that were true when this study was published a few years ago and are still true now. I won't read them through, but there's several points here that are quite familiar, I think, at this point with for most of you in the audience. Platform companies control access to audiences much more than newspapers used to. The people are running into news in different contexts and in different environments that are less controlled by news media producers and by journalists. Journalists struggles with keeping people's attention, especially in the digital age, and that's an certainly increasing as a challenge for the industry. And one that underlies them all, I think, is the business model. The fund news are really have changed for the worse, and they have not gotten better over the past few decades. Of course, like news is just as important and very, very diverse, and we're seeing like amazing things happen across the journalism sphere. But that is something that we'll explore a little bit more in the further charts. So again, the first chart that I'd like to introduce you to is something that PJ mentioned, is about journalism is. So this is a study that we did. I think it's across 1.2 million posts that we looked throughout the public conversation. And we're just looking at how people complete the sentence. Journalism is what? And this is a bit of a map for 2024, at least, of some of the top narratives that are emerging around journalism and how people describe it. Like, what is the word that they use to complete this sentence? And here we see, many different bubbles. The size of the bubbles is the number of engagements of all the posts that mention that word or that concept. And whereas on the y-axis here, you see the number of posts that actually show up with that word and journalism. So as you can see, top right, largest post and largest engagement is this narrative about journalism being dead. That is something that we saw emerge at the beginning of 2024 and throughout the year, really, as many media organizations were going through very painful and public layoffs. And so this narrative emerged about people discussing the state of journalism, really. And again, this is a map of perceptions, but perceptions in the current state of our media ecosystem are very, very important, and they tend to accelerate whatever is the underlying reality for the industry. We've coded those in positive and negative, broadly speaking. The negative ones tend to be along those lines of journalism being in a crisis, struggling, failing. But there's another note that we'll cover a little bit more about people talking about it as corrupt and biased, and looking at the intentions of the news media. Of course, the more positive ones are also get some attentions, but it's a little bit different. It's a different type of conversation. It's the type of conversation that is more focusing not on the optimism necessarily, but on the importance of journalism and just how important and vital it is for our societies, for democracy, for civic life. So if we go on to the next chart, we're going to be able to break this down a little bit over time, and we see that this is bunching again, like these words a little bit more tightly into buckets. So the dead is like dying, dead. Everything in state of decline is anything that relates to the struggles of the industry, whereas biased and corrupt is in looking at all the words that relate to bias, misinformation, and intentions. But we see that over time it's quite a spiky conversation. So every now and then one of those stories, or one of those perspectives rather, will really pop off. And those moments are tied, of course, to events in the real world. And PJ, Alex, maybe you want to jump in here and kind of offer a little bit of perspective, because you've seen this play out in real time.
Shall I go first, Alex?
Yeah, please do.
Yep. Okay, cool. Yeah, so I can speak about this from the UK perspective. So we, dived into this from a global perspective, and then we looked into different regions across the world. So UK, you can look at these spikes, and it can seem quite terrifying that so many people, so many times, are saying that journalism is dead, that journalism's dying, that it's biased, that it's in decline. That's quite scary. But one thing that really did have a particular impact on this conversation of what journalism is in 2024 was, of course, the UK general election. And a lot of the posts across social media about this were critical of how the mainstream UK media were covering the general election. So a lot of the posts that we saw, across X, across all these different social media platforms, it would be criticism of how the debates were framed. On TV and radio and in print. It would be how, like, the approach of journalists, how they interviewed people. There was a lot of criticism about one particular political journalist, and I won't say their name, but maybe you can probably guess. Maybe you've seen a lot of criticism about this particular journalist, but that's where a lot of the criticism would come from. It would be about the UK general election, and then it would be journalism is dead. So that has been the fact that people were so passionate and so frustrated by the mainstream media's coverage of the general election. It shows that can be quite saddening to see that, but it also shows just how important and how vital journalism is, how much we all rely on it, and where it falls short, we want it to be better, and people will go to their platforms and complain about it. Whether this slightly more negative take on journalism will continue now that we're past the general election, now that we're into the new Labour leadership, we'll have to see. But people do tend to go on social media to share a negative viewpoint rather than, you did a great job on that piece, on that interview. So that's where a lot of the criticism lied, particularly in the UK this year, and we'll probably be seeing a lot more of that maybe in the US conversation as well.
Yeah, I was actually going to pick up on that part of what you said, PJ, because I think you mentioned the US conversation and the UK conversation, and we sort of looked at this conversation, UK, US, and Australia. And it was interesting to see the UK and US, they had a lot of nuances and obviously a lot of complexity that was different between the two, but the ultimate tone of the conversation and some of the words used really trended in the same direction. And maybe that's kind of unsurprising given there's a lot of overlap between those, the writers that people read, the brands such as The Guardian, The New Yorker, etc., who are big across both sides of the Atlantic. And obviously both, as you say, have had election years, which is gonna taint things to an element. But I think it was really interesting was seeing how Australian conversations actually really bucked this trend. And we looked into why that was. And when I say buck the trend, a lot of that was people saying, journalism is important, journalism is crucial. Still a bit of negativity, but it was actually far less. So when we looked into why that was, we saw it come down to two things, really. One of which is there's a lot of legal cases and political conversations taking place in Australia right now around news codes, around how the relationship between news organizations and social media sites, etc. And there's a lot of people both within and without the media making impassioned sort of pleas on behalf of journalism as an institution. And also Julian Assange is a pretty major participant in that conversation. So obviously, if you're an Australian, this is another Australian who is one of the most famous, if not the most famous journalist. I know people debate whether he's a journalist, but he's certainly one of the most famous figures in the space in the world. And obviously, there's lots happened with him, and that's triggered a lot of conversation in the space.
So if we go on to the next slide, Alex, we're going to start covering the audiences of news avoidance. So what we did here is a slightly different approach. So we listened to the public conversations about news avoidance. So this is people publicly saying on social networks, I am really done with the news. I don't want to read the news. I stay away from the news. These kind of sentences here, and these kind of explicit statement that shows that this person is actively trying to cultivate that behavior for themselves. And we tried to understand which community communities were participating in that conversation. And we do this through audience segmentation. Audience segmentation just means that we take the public conversation, all these posts, and we kind of turn it into an analysis, a quantitative analysis of the people who are participating in those conversations, and those people get bunched in different communities. So what you see here is the top communities in this conversation. It's pretty typical audience. We have a Democratic activists, conservative patriots in the US, as well as like folks who are more involved with the profession themselves, like political journalists, writers, as well as crypto investors. And what this audience segmentation is useful to see, it really helps you understand that different people talk about the same topic differently, which is something that we really keep saying over and over because it's a simple little line, but it's a very powerful one to understand the global public conversations that are happening. And so what we did here is just not take this communities, but then look at the motivations, the stated motivations for their embracing this behavior of news avoidance. And we broke it down in terms of the way people talk about it in three main buckets. So the kind of map to some of the conversations that we've already analyzed in the previous slides. So one is boredom and fatigue. So people feel bored by the news, or just don't seem to have the energy to engage with the news. Mental health. This is a very interesting reason and drivers for news avoidance. People feel disempowered while reading the news. The volume of news can be like overwhelming, can like really distract people, make them unfocused, but also make them suffer because there's very little they feel like they can do. A sense of powerlessness emerges. And then misinformation and bias, again, blaming the news media for being biased or for spreading misinformation, which is a good reason then to avoid the news going forward. And so if we look at those audiences that we just broke down and look at their motivations, we can see that they vary quite a bit throughout audiences. And I'd like to single out a couple of those just to try and understand like what those motivations might be. Conservative patriots, again, like one of the larger conversations here, there's very much a focus on misinformation and bias. This is mostly American conservatives. And they will explicitly say, don't read the news. It's biased. It's corrupt. It's not going to give you like a true render of reality. If we look at a different group, for instance, crypto investors or democratic activists here in the middle of the screen, we see that mental health is a much larger concern. Somewhat expected, I guess, like for democratic activists, there's a little bit more sensitivity for the mental health conversations in general in progressive groups. But what surprised me the most was crypto investors, which I didn't necessarily think of somebody who was always prioritizing mental health. But in general, when we looked at this conversation and drilled down a little bit more, we understood that this was kind of an approach of saying, well, there's nothing you can do about what's happening out there in the news, what's happening out there in the market very often. Just put your head down, invest your money, do your work, save up, and you'll be okay. It was more distancing themselves from things that they don't control. Why is this useful? This is useful because it can help us understand different drivers, and it can help us, for instance, for news organization, it can help them talk to different audiences with a slightly different tone, with slightly different campaigns to try and counter news avoidance, to try and explain, to try also to understand. I think this is a very, very interesting data for news organizations to try and understand why the product as it is right now in the current media ecosystem is not appealing, and why people actively go about avoiding it. But I think, PJ, you'd look at this a little bit further, and you have some stats to share about this as well, right?
I do indeed. So I'm sure we've all read the Reuters Institute Digital News Report from 2023, which was really interesting, really useful, but it has got some scary statistics in it. So the people that responded to the survey, those surveyed, 46% of them, they now avoid the news. And that's a 24% rise since 2017. And 70% of the publishers that were surveyed said that they were worried about news avoidance and fatigue, which they should be from looking at this graph here. So Teresa, she asked about solutions-based journalism. So this is one of the ways that was pinpointed for publishers to get people back into reading the news. So explanatory journalism, solutions-based journalism. A lot of people avoid the news. They don't want to engage with it because it just makes them feel so disempowered, so powerless. And another way of making the audience feel empowered, of course, is to give them solutions to things, but also using an audience first strategy as well. So that's something that we've talking to the media as just media interviews and things that we do for our newsletters. A lot of big media brands are talking about how important audience first is now. So this might mean just little things like incorporating Q&As, like at the end of articles, doing a lot more on Twitter, doing a lot more vertical video, which we'll be going into in a moment, but really engaging with communities and letting them know that they have an impact on what publishers and what reporters are covering as well. It isn't just that they're being reported to, they're involved in the creation of the news process as well, and that they have a choice on what they can engage with and what's being created. So another scary stat as well. So 2023's Edelman Trust Barometer found that the UK is one of the countries with the lowest opinion, the lowest amount of faith in the media. But like a slightly more positive thing, trust is up by 2% from 2022, which isn't huge, but it's getting there. And the other things that we'll be talking about, hopefully, will contribute to this and raise the trust even further and get people, trusting journalism again. And then we'll get less of the journalism is dead and more of the journalism is vital and important.
Thanks, PJ. Yeah, so I mean, as you say, like engagement is a bit of a problem right now. People's opinions about journalism, whether they even want to go and seek it out or find it, is obviously not an amazing place. But hopefully, this is where we sort of covered the doom and gloom side of journalism. And I'm not saying it's all going to be rosy from here on in this presentation, but certainly we're looking a lot more at what different brands and individuals can do to arrest this and to find solutions and find ways of connecting with different audiences. So part of this is via different platforms, different channels, and one of these is podcasts. So we thought we noticed something kind of interesting with how podcasts fit into the news cycle, namely that they clearly aren't for breaking news. They're obviously a slow medium. Like if you find out something from a podcast, generally you've just missed a lot of newspapers, radio, social media, etc. But what podcasts do tend to do is almost fulfill that, what might we call the analysis or comment function that we might historically have seen in, I don't know, a long radio special or, deep into the middle of a big newspaper, right? So you might see breaking news on like page 1 or 2, page 10, there's maybe a bit of a detailed explanation as to what this geopolitical, economic, what have you thing means for you, means for the country, etc. And it's that space that a lot of these news podcasts have slid quite seamlessly into. And we wanted to find a bit of a case study for testing this hypothesis. And what we landed on was the conversation around polluted waterways, which is a pretty big conversation globally, but especially in the UK. So the data you can see here is basically us saying, let's find any mention of, polluted waterways over podcasts over the last 3 or 4 months, I think it was, and see what comes up. And we split this according to broadcast and independent. So independent is obviously where you have could be just a couple of people in a microphone and they've got a bit of a thing behind them, or broadcaster, you've got all the BBC, you've got the Guardian, all these big media conglomerates having their own podcast offerings, and also quite a few podcast native ones as well. And what we can see immediately is there's just a huge amount of news conversation, particularly by these broadcasters. And so it definitely seems like all of these channels are really embracing the fact that you're getting access to different people or the same people but at different times of the day via reaching them with podcasts. So you're not necessarily competing against something like a newspaper, but you might be getting someone when they're going for a run, doing tidying, doing cleaning. And it's also addressing, obviously, this need for analysis and slightly deeper apprehension of the issues that is out there on part of audiences. When we looked a bit closer, we did notice 1 or 2 kind of interesting things, one of which is when you look at the number of podcasts, even though we have quite a few here, if you were to compare this to the online news articles or the social media, say, over the same period, obviously it's far, far smaller because creating a podcast is a lot more resource and time intensive. So one thing that's quite interesting is if you are a reasonably, mid or large sized media organization, you might be producing, say, I don't know, something between like 10 and 20 podcasts over like this sort of 3-month period. Obviously, that means there's a lot more editorial decision making as to what you want to focus on. And so it's quite interesting over this period seeing which publications were really active and out there on water pollution and which ones weren't. So, for instance, we saw that the BBC and Guardian were, not just in the UK, but globally, by a mile, the biggest, most influential podcast channels on this topic. Whereas some other places like the Wall Street Journal, like one or two others, they wrote an awful lot on the topic, but they weren't producing any podcasts on it. And that was largely because the US election was almost taking up all their podcast space and effort. But it did mean that all these people who might only be getting their analysis via podcast, or they might be making this part of the daily routine, they suddenly weren't hearing about this topic. So it's all sort of second and third order effects, but podcasts are obviously a very novel channel for getting this information out to people. But there's also a lot of implications in the way you do that and the way people listen to it. Now, the other one, which is a little bit of a counterpoint, and which I also hope to open out to PJ for thoughts in a moment, is TikTok. So, we've already covered, podcasts as being this very deep, contemplative, very deep way of talking about the news in which you can contemplate the news. There we are. But TikToks are very different. So obviously it's all limited to a much shorter time period. And also it's even shorter than that, right? Because you're not just waiting for someone to watch it for a minute. You're trying to really get their attention straight away to make sure they don't skip. And that's obviously going to impact the kind of news, kind of things you choose to cover and the way you cover it as well. So we looked again at this time, not a particular topic, but we went to look at all the people who might self-identify in some way or form as a journalist. And what we found was really interesting because you see there's this real clear split between what might be called, again, the mainstream, sort of the broadcast names who are on the platform, and also the independent citizen voices who are there as well. And you can see that the latter really outnumber the former. So it's still something that's very driven by individual users. This is it's a not super straightforward picture. Like if you want to look at individual follow accounts, some things like, I don't know, CNN, NBC, they're huge. They have far, far more followers than your individual like citizen journalist. But on individual pieces of content, the citizen journalists can massively outperform the established names simply because the way that TikTok works obviously is not, oh, let me navigate to my favorite account. It's you're getting served everything algorithmically. So if something's engaging audiences, it almost doesn't matter to a certain extent who the person posting it is. If enough people like you have indicated that they engage with that content, you're going to end up seeing it on your own newsfeed. And then, we mentioned before, like this impacts what topics get covered, what audiences see. And, this was a not comprehensive look at all the conversation on TikTok, but this was a very large sample data set we ran to give us an indicator as to, what's that split between mainstream accounts, the citizen accounts in what they cover and what they talk about. So you can see that the mainstream accounts, they veer a lot more towards talking about politics. And I think it's unsurprising given that we are in an election year. So we saw this both in the UK over the summer, and also we're seeing it a lot in the US right now. It's also one where potentially having the resources and the contacts and the people on the ground is actually going to be a bit of an advantage for the established media company. So if you have a reporter who's at a Democratic convention, say, or who's at Westminster, then them getting their phone out and doing a piece of content is going to be engaging a new audience, but ultimately they're still the people who are going to be producing, the best content people want to listen to. Whereas when you move around a little bit onto things like culture, gossip, some of these other categories, it's a bit more democratic. Because basically, one person amplifying a news story that's been carried somewhere else is no different to another. So you end up seeing a bit of a smorgasbord of the types of voice that end up being quite big on here. But PJ, I know you looked at this specifically only last week, actually, through more of a UK perspective, like narrowing down some of those global insights to see what's happening over here. Like, what stood out to you when you looked at this in terms of what voices were big and just general trends, really?
Yeah, so I'd just like to give, just point out that we've literally just released a report about this. TikTok journalism came out today. So do have a look out for that. TikTok journalism, the platform's impact on news audiences. So it's a full report on this if you want more information about it. But it was really interesting actually to see just the emergence of TikTok journalists and how important they are and how this is already completely changing just the media landscape as a whole. What's really interesting about TikTok journalists is that they have this mixture. They're a reporter, but they also function as an influencer, and they can tell stories in a way that sort of the I guess most journalists that are affiliated with like a particular publisher, a particular organization, they can share opinions that the mainstream media often can't. And a lot of their posts and their reporting, it can cross over into activism. So they can more easily, but they can cover things like politics, the economy, global conflicts in ways that perhaps like the TikTok account for BBC News can't. They can also, it's more democratic as well in the way they approach things. They can create content in a variety of different languages as well. They can speak to smaller communities as well. Whereas like these bigger accounts that come from publishers, it's more of a generalized look at things. So it means that the news can reach different audiences across the world, maybe people that don't feel that they've been spoken to before, that news that is relevant to them specifically. So it really is, I think it's an important space for the media to look at, for creating their content, for reaching audiences, and also for PR and comms people who want to get their stories out as well, or boost awareness for something. It's a really, and not just TikTok, but all vertical video formats as well. There's a lot of challenges with this, because maybe you could see that it's taking attention away from like traditional news formats like print, or broadcast, like traditional broadcast on TV and radio. But there's so many opportunities with this as well, rather than just trying to target BBC News, Sky News, ITV News. There's so many other people that could help share your story across these platforms.
I think that's a great point, PJ, because I think some people's mileage will vary on this. Like, it's not an entirely good thing or entirely bad thing, right? Like, on the one hand, it's lowering the barriers of entry to a lot of voices who might otherwise have not got a chance to go and talk about their own communities. I know, speaking back to Australia, there's a lot of indigenous content on there, which is like people being able to voice their own stories, tackle misapprehensions, which obviously is a very positive thing. And at the same time, you can also see the potential for a lot more misinformation if a lot of people who don't have to go through the standard, journalistic accreditation, build up the same contacts, can just say things for their viral oomph. But as you say, PJ, I think it's whether it's good, whether it's bad, it's definitely something that you can't ignore, and it's something that people need to start factoring into their different PR and comms campaigns. So this one is moving away from the platforms a little bit, although it is still very tied to platforms as a topic. It's a bit more on the hyperconnectivity of where we're at now with everything. So when you have a story that's published, especially when it's an investigation, what we call here a scoop, the passage it takes through different online spaces is obviously very different to what it was in even the recent past. And that's something that we look to investigate in a study that we'll be releasing very shortly. So we took a few key stories and we said, okay, can we chart the moment this was broken, and then see how it moved through the different media ecosystems, like who engaged with it, etc. And one of the examples we took here was the US food prison scandal. So in this instance, there was basically a lot of prisoners who were doing manual labor on behalf of, I think, what ultimately ended up being some quite well-known household brands. So I don't think they were doing the labor for the brand, but they were doing it for an intermediate company, and ultimately those products and those foodstuffs ended up getting sold by brands like Walmart, Coca-Cola, etc. And what we did was we tracked this from the moment that article sort of went into the world, and then you see how it moves around. And you can see from the shape here, it's not something that, kept on growing. It's not something that was steady. It has a very distinctive shape. Namely, there's this massive surge in interest when the article's dropped. Then things calm down. And then there's a secondary surge, which is when it gets taken forward by people who are outside the normal media inner circles. Before we move on to talking about who some of those people were, one thing here that we found really interesting was this is a story that impacts a number of different brands. So, I mentioned you have Walmart, Coca-Cola, a lot of what you might call the quintessentially massive US brands, but it didn't impact the conversation around all of those brands equally. And that's simply, in some cases, down to really arbitrary decisions. So when someone reports about this and they write about it, the decision they make to list those brands, which could be done essentially in any order, can have an effect, like a ripple effect later on. So someone sees, I think in this instance, it was Walmart were written first a number of times. And then we saw that then had a knock-on effect where Walmart were getting written about it more and more and more because they were the first one that came up. And that's something that, to some extent, if you're in the PR team at Walmart, it's quite hard to manage, right? It's just bad luck to one extent where it could just have easily been a Coca-Cola or someone else up top. But then once it has happened, you need to know about it. And you need to know that this is actually becoming more of an issue for you than it is for the other people here. And you might need to take some steps to address it. And part of addressing it is also meeting some of these audiences, on their own terms. So that can be in the language they're using. You want to be able to tackle the actual issues people have. You don't want to go in with a very generalized approach and say, oh, we kind of get you're upset about it. It's like, well, what are they upset about? And why are different communities and different people upset in different ways? And that also, has an impact on how this stuff spreads in the first instance. So what you can see here is a bit of a network chart. We won't go massively into depth of it here, but what you can see here is different types of speakers or different types of sharers to engage with the content. So you start off with that initial spike as this being something that's driven by, news, driven by journalists, driven by, people who are quite plugged into that world on Twitter. People see that and think, oh gosh, and they have an opinion, and that contributes to that first massive spike you saw. But then a little later on, you have a lot of anonymous Reddit users. So on the one instance, these guys are anonymous. It's a little bit harder to derive things about what community they belong to. Except obviously on Reddit, all these conversations take part on different subreddits. So even though you actually have that level of anonymity, you can still get a sense of how that conversation is developing by seeing, well, this is taking part on a conversation about, the prison system. Is it taking place in a conversation about PR nightmares? Is it taking place on a completely different, maybe quite surprising subreddit? And that's true all across the board, really. So across different forums, different spaces, different Facebook pages, different TikTok audiences. You basically need to modulate your approach and the way you reach out to these audiences depending on where that conversation is playing out. But then this is one a little bit closer to home. And again, PJ, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, so this story, I think we probably all heard about this, the Richard Sharp story that spread. So this just really shows, I think the overreaching story of this is the fact that even if a story starts behind a paywall, it can still spread very, very quickly. So this started as an exclusive piece from the Sunday Times about the relationship between Richard Sharp and Boris Johnson. And of course, Boris Johnson is always going to get headlines and attention on social media whenever there's controversy around what's happening with him. So that already was going to be kind of going against Richard Sharp. But so this story spread very quickly. You can see the peaks here circled in red. So it may have started in print, it may have started online behind a paywall, but it quickly went across social media. The story spread, more and more people got angry, the controversy spread, and then it resulted in Richard Sharp resigning from his role. But that didn't stop the anger and the discord. So that story continued. You can see another little spike there in June 2023. So I think the main takeaway from this is if you're on a PR team, you're on a comms team, if something like this happens, it's really important to get your plan for crisis comms, I guess minimizing the harm of a potential story like this. Get those plans in place early on, because you can't buy up all the copies of a paper anymore to stop a story. Once it's out there, and you can't completely predict how stories are going to spread across different platforms, but you can plan for it. You can plan for what you're going to do once a story is out there. So I guess this is a cautionary tale, really.
Yeah, and it's interesting to say about the paywall as well, PJ, because I think we've seen not just this, but a lot of things we've studied over the last few years. Stories can still travel if they're behind a paywall, so either here on the Telegraph or FT or something, but they tend to travel at a slightly more almost like controlled, say like UK specific, often way. Whereas when something is on, I think, The Guardian or the Daily Mail, or two UK publications that they don't have paywalls and they also have massive audiences in America and Australia, that stuff can really spread like wildfire, and you can still find these stories. You think they're gone, but they're still burning away just about halfway around the world in a different community. And if you're the brand in question, you might not even be aware of it until it swings back around to bite you again. So it's interesting. The paywall does limit things or focus it to an extent, but as you say, as long as people are talking about it on Twitter and Reddit, it's going to get out there and it's going to cause a problem for you. Okay, so Davide, I'll hand back over to you.
Thank you. Yes. So we've looked at journalism and audiences through so many different perspectives already. We're going to add one more beyond how stories spread, beyond TikTok journalism, news avoidance. This is another perspective on journalism in general and how it's doing. And it tries to take journalism from the perspective of the organizations that invest, that produce, and sometimes even profit, maybe don't profit as much these days, and how they use it as a business as a business tool. From a business perspective, journalism is being used increasingly to enhance an organization's brand, and many of those organizations have now become large bundles of different services. Right, news is just one part of it, but here we can see like three examples of recent campaigns from the Wall Street Journal, from the New York Times, from the CNN. Each of them trying to tell the story, actively tell the story of its investment in journalism and of the fact that journalism is in itself like something that's very good for society, and trying to use that to enhance their brand in a similar way in which many organizations, for instance, try to tell the story of their sustainability efforts to enhance their brand. Journalism is still seen and perceived as a public good, even though it is criticized, and we'll see even those conversations here are criticized, but it's still something that media brands in this case like to invest in. I'm dialing in from New York City. I was in Times Square the other day. Times Square is, very expensive for advertisers, but also like very competitive environment. There was a huge billboard from the Economist that was talking about its journalism as one of its unique selling points. Now, I didn't put the picture here just because I thought it was a very good picture, good enough for a webinar, but it clearly wasn't when I uploaded it onto my computer. But there is a lot of brand building effort that is happening around news media brands around journalism. And so what we did was try to understand which news media brands are more tightly associated with journalism as a practice, as an institution, across conversations. So if we go into the next slide, Alex, maybe we can start to see how different brands are, which share of voice really they have in the journalism conversation, and how tightly they are connected with journalism in the public mind. So we begin to see the broadcasters, of course, are much more present. They're a much bigger presence in our lives and in people's attention. They control a little bit better that distribution of news and of attention. But then we looked at wires, we looked at newspapers, as well as somebody who is one outlet per country or per region rather, that was a little bit focused on the financial side. And we began to see the different brands are talked about in different amounts, and that doesn't necessarily match the actual investment in terms of journalism, in terms of newsrooms that their bureaus that they're keeping open, in terms of investigations that they publish, because this in part is a brand building activity that they're doing. That perception is not one that is entirely based on the actual journalism produced, which, for instance, wires invest a whole lot more in. They're at a different step of the journalism production. What's in these conversations about journalism? So we looked at whether if we go on to the next slide, Alex, we looked at whether some of these conversations had more of that criticism that we've seen in the previous charts as well, or whether it was mostly positive. I personally don't think that changes that much. People still think of journalism as a public good and will continue to have a positive brand association, even if they're criticizing an organization for their journalism. But we can see, for instance, that the financial outlets, the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal specifically, rank higher in terms of positive mentions, even though they are criticized as well. With then, the wires still mostly on the negative side, but showing a decent amount of large conversations that are positive with relation to journalism, whereas the broadcasters and other news organizations are a little bit more polarizing in the public's eye. For instance, in the New York Times here in the United States, especially in an election year, or the BBC in the UK, begin to see quite a bit of negative journalism association. Alex, if we go on to the next slide, I think we're done with this bit. Yeah, so maybe I'll let you talk about journalism, which is the last item that we're looking at this. And I'd remind everybody, please get your questions in. We've got so many great questions already. We tried to answer some of those live, but now once we're done with the presentation, we'll take more and we'll revisit some of the more interesting ones from the ones that you submitted. There's a Q&A box right in the middle of your screen, so please type away and let us know what you think.
Right. Oh yeah, PJ, do you want to talk us through a little bit of some of the local journalism things that I know you've been looking into earlier this month?
Yeah, absolutely. So another one of our recent reports, one of our recent pieces, was looking into local journalism. So as we mentioned before, local journalism, particularly in the UK, has been in decline. A lot of local newspapers were closed over the last decade, lots of closures, and lots of local news being moved into centralized hubs at big publishers. So journalists not being out in their communities, they'd be reporting on communities from bigger cities. So there was a disconnect between the local journalism and actual locals. So this has changed, like particularly over the last few years. And one of the things that we noticed looking into this, things that are working, that are bringing local journalism back. So one thing is like, ironically, lockdown, I think it really ended up bringing communities together, even though people weren't together physically. It meant a lot of people would be joining local Facebook groups. They'd be following hashtags on Twitter to do with their local area and connecting with people that way. And that brought another way for local journalism to connect with their communities again, to launch online, to launch into different platforms, like starting TikTok accounts or or Substacks as well. So we looked at a couple of like particular examples of successful local journalist brands. So we looked at the Manchester Mill, which is on Substack, which is a newsletter for Manchester, obviously. And then we also looked at what's happening in Suffolk as well with local news. So what's working in Suffolk is nicheification. So looking at getting followers, getting loyalty by looking at particular topics. So one thing that's really working in Suffolk is sport. So I don't know anything about football at all, but lots of people are really into that. So that's getting a lot of people engaging with like Suffolk, local Suffolk news brands again. And then for the Manchester Mill, again, it's that audience first approach. It's really getting out into communities and covering it from the local community. And you can see here that means that in the local news, like conversation in Manchester, people that work at the Manchester Mill are like highly influential across social media. And one of the biggest influencers there is actually the founder of the Manchester Mill, who has a background in like big national press titles as well. And then he's launched this newsletter on Substack, which is doing really well. And I think it gives an interesting, I guess, blueprint for other publications, for other people that might want to do a similar thing across the country. They can look at nicheification, they look at what their local community is actually interested in, and they can look at other platforms, not just going online, not just starting a print newspaper, but looking at social media, looking at Substack, and engaging with people in different ways.
Yeah, thanks, PJ. I think the interesting thing about here is obviously there's a hefty caveat here, which is this is not going to be a panacea to all different local journalists, right? So we use the example of Suffolk and Ipswich Town. Like obviously that's largely driven by Ipswich Town having their best season for like however many 20, 30 years. Like not all local journalists will be able to say like, great, like our local team is doing amazing. Let's put loads of time and effort behind, making that the bedrock of our subscription strategy, our engagement strategy, etc. Like often you're not going to be in that situation. Likewise, the Manchester Mill is seeing great engagement, especially off the back of some of the stories they've broke, some of the exclusives they broke around the Manchester scene. But again, like, they've started from a small base, they're going up quite high. But is that going to translate to longer term interest? Is that going to translate to a period maybe they don't have as many scoops to break? But I think what is interesting is, as PJ says, is it does nonetheless show green shoots. Like not all of these approaches are going to work. Not all of these approaches that generate engagement are then going to generate the kind of money that allows these papers to become self-sufficient and underwrite all the other sorts of local journalism they want to do. But they are signs bucking the trend we've seen in the last 20 years, which is just the truism that local journalism's on the way down, it's on the way out. And there are, again, to echo PJ's point, there are a few people who are saying like, well, actually, we've got a new approach or we're doing a different thing here. And sure, most of them won't work, but enough of them will that hopefully you start seeing a much more interesting scene. And obviously that's going to also have knock-on effects for PR and comms pros who want to reach out to these publications and engage the local communities that they service. But yeah, I think that's probably everything that we were going to show from the research and insight side today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can answer any questions. You can see all of our faces.
So quite a few questions have come through throughout our presentation, many tied to different charts and different graphs that we were showing. I tried to answer some of them live, but there were a couple that were maybe demanded a slightly bigger platform. So this first one is from John. He's inquiring about the age demography and from our research, specifically on TikTok influencers and also the TikTok audience consumers. This is particularly germane right now because just today, Alex and PJ have published an excellent report on TikTok journalism. By the way, every single one of those charts that we showed has a full study behind it. So you're welcome to kind of go on our site, please, and see for yourself. Download the papers and kind of reach out if you have any questions specifically about them. Some of them are upcoming, but the TikTok journalism is just up today. So maybe Alex and PJ, you can give a little bit more information about that. The one thing I would say to John's question is that the TikTok audience in general is growing up. I think sometimes the perception of platforms and what kind of age group they are best set to reach evolves like pretty quickly over time. Not just because we're all growing up at the same time, but also because it attracts new parts of the public that are interested in participating in this, and we're starting to see TikTok being full of people in their 30s and their 40s and beyond. But more specifically, I guess with the study that you did around TikTok journalism, like what kind of demographic signals did you get?
Yes, it's a really interesting one because we saw a few things that stood out in that respect. One of which was around the US election. So we did one chart where we monitored the activity on some of the TikTok journalist channels we were following, and we also monitored the activity in we might call the conventional, the print or online press over the same time. And sometimes the peaks coincided with each other. So when there was the assassination attempt on Donald Trump, obviously both spikes at the same time. Like both audiences were very engaged with that. But then later on, when it was the presidential debate, we saw the traditional media like really put a lot of time and attention on that. Whereas TikTok, they actually went for a different topic, which was about the same time, which was Taylor Swift's endorsement of Kamala Harris. So that was kind of a bit of a signal for us where you could tell that there's a slightly different demographic on TikTok who are obviously far more interested in the latter than the former. I also don't think they're necessarily wrong to be. Like, obviously, there's a slightly patronizing take on that, where someone could say like, "Oh, it just is young people; they don't know, and they're not engaging with the meat of it." But those a lot of the dialogue around the debate was not exactly. It was quite spicy. It was quite like confrontational. Taylor Swift, someone who has a massive fandom, maybe her endorsement actually is going to be more momentous than whatever they discussed in that debate. So. Some very interesting signals, and also I think it's just a bit of an underlying lesson to not always dismiss some of these things when they come up as being like, that's just for a younger audience. Because as Davide said, like, these audiences are rapidly aging, but also, it can have massive implications, impacts on anything from like voting intention to what we think of brands.
Thank you. There were more questions about TikTok and specifically about Gen Z and Gen Alpha, how they relate to news and journalism in general. Did you see anything specifically on TikTok that related to the type of engagement that news stories were getting? Because you look not just at TikTok journalists who are broadcasting, but also like people reacting to breaking news, right?
Yeah, we did. I don't know, PJ, if you have anything you want to kick off on there.
Yeah, so from looking at the actual accounts that were reporting on the news, like particularly, the general election, UK politics, US politics, like mainstream media TikTok accounts from people like BBC News, Channel 4, etc. There's they still do well with their reporting. They get lots of eyes on their content, lots of followers. But then the citizen journalists, independent journalists, they tend to get higher engagement with a lot of specific pieces of content. And from what we could see, that's because of the extra commentary that they add. So from the actual reporting, to what Alex was saying earlier, these big media brands, these publishers will have the resources to send people out and actually cover specific stories. So of course that content does well. But then the younger audience, they want to hear, okay, well, what does this mean? What's the opinion on that? They might want a slightly different editing style, a little bit of a lighter approach to it rather than a traditional news broadcasting approach that you'd get on TV, back in the day, people still have news broadcasts. I'm old, this is what I say. So yeah, the independent citizen journalists on TikTok, they'll have a lighter approach, they'll have like different editing style, and they'll give their opinion, which tends to attract younger audiences who are more used to engaging with influencer content, actually following people, having like a parasocial relationship with these people. They can get this with reporters on TikTok as well, independent reporters who are giving I guess a spicier take, a more personality driven take on the news that someone like BBC News just can't do. And that tends to work for younger audiences. So that wouldn't just be Gen Z, that would be Gen Alpha as well. But and also us millennials, we're still young as well. That tends to work.
Yeah, it's actually just also I was going to say it's what Dai, who's the researcher who worked on this with PJ and myself, I think she termed it news as entertainment. I think that's quite a pithy way of encapsulating a lot of what you're talking about there, PJ, right? It's the idea that news is not just there to have that sort of civic responsibility that Davide was alluding to, and all the things around The Economist, the Wall Street Journal, the taglines they're using, but it's also there to like be funny and entertaining in a way that it wasn't necessarily for previous generations, and in a way that maybe, if you're going to be downbeat on this, is potentially slightly worrying for the direction of where some of this might be headed.
And there's another dimension there, besides the one you mentioned, of course, that actually somebody from the audience mentioned, James Reed. He shared a common question about news avoidance, going back to why people might be avoiding the news. Is it avoidance of journalism and news per se, or is it avoidance of a perceived elite agenda, which some people feel is amplified and narrated by the media, and which leads to them to seek what they think they are authentic voices? And James also shared that's not necessarily his view. And I thought that was like a very interesting read, because I think not just with TikTok, but also with podcast is kind of what we're seeing. A personality commentator of the facts that, still get reported for the most part by news organizations becomes the central element and the central framing element of that story, and the one that the audiences seem to gravitate a little bit more. Have you seen that in your podcast analysis, Alex, as well? The personality driven type of attraction that maybe is a little bit more foreign to traditional journalism.
Yeah, I think definitely. And to return to a topic we've returned to a lot of it's been driven by politics and the election. So, a lot of the podcasts that have really done good numbers and achieved massive listenership this year are a lot of the very political ones, right? If you fire up Apple, fire up Spotify, you'll see a lot of the top ones are anything from the rest is politics in the UK to a lot of like the Pod Save America family in the US. And that, I think, is a really good example of it's all being mediated through different personalities. And it's much more immediate, isn't it? I think people gradually would draw a sense of like different news readers from like, just turning on the news, seeing the same face again and again, but it's a lot more subtle, and you might develop like, fondness or dislike for a certain newsreader, but it would happen like over time, iteratively. Whereas now, like, the personality is so front and center, and it's being entirely, mediated through that. And I think people are embracing it either. I think also you're not seeing a lot of these personalities across podcasts and TikTok like really make much claim to the center ground in a way that a lot of traditional publications might, even if they are on the left or right. A lot of people might claim to be perhaps more centrist than they are. A lot of these people are just leaning fully into saying like, no, I'm almost an activist come journalist, and making that very clear in how they go about things.
Yeah, it's interesting because in a way, that kind of goes back to broadcast journalism and the fact that broadcast journalism, the CNNs and the Fox News, are they invest quite a bit in journalism, some of them more than others, but they do have this personality driven. Most of their budgets like go to finance, actually, like personalities that can drive that kind of conversation. But at the same time, they're the ones that, if we look at the way the journalism association with their brands tends to be the strongest negative one, whereas on the other side we see like these more, maybe slightly more personal, intimate relationships, because they're happening on your phone from TikTok or from the podcast that are actually attracting folks. So in a way, it seems like it's a tension that's developing on two ends. One of people wanting a little bit of that framing, a little bit of that commentary, and others maybe not wanting it as much.
Yeah, I think it's also, I think, a much harder break for English audiences, or British audiences, than American, for instance, because I think if you're British, you're so used to what might be called like video content or stuff that feels more real and tangible, being mediated through a lot of these relatively centrist organizations, right? Like BBC, ITV, even Sky, people like that, are generally around a sort of middle ground and try and not impart too much political comment on things. Whereas obviously in the US, there's much more of a recent history of things like Fox News and CNN. You sort of take sides a bit more openly. So yeah, when you see and hear these people on podcasts and TikTok, and you see their face and you can build an attachment to their personality, and they're saying something that's very politically aligned one way or the other, I think that's a bit more it's a bit more of a break with what we're used to for a British audience.
Wonderful. We're at the top of the hour here, and I think it's time for us to wrap up. We will be following up with the recording of this webinar, of course, as well as all the pieces that have been published so far from this campaign. This is a campaign that you will continue to see if you're following us. Please do follow us on social media, on our newsletters, on our websites. We will be having live events. We will be having research reports, blogs, and much more around the topic of journalism, which is such an important cornerstone of our media ecosystem. So I want to thank PJ and Alex for sharing all these insights. Thank you so much for joining. To everybody in the audience, thank you for your great questions. And yeah, we'll speak to you soon via email. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.